Hey everybody, welcome into the back room. I am Andy Ostroy. We have attorney Mark Zaid with us today. We're going to chat with Mark in just a second. But first, thanks for tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please rate and review and follow or subscribe, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. So, Mark Zaid is a Washington, D.C. based attorney specializing in crisis management and handling administrative and litigation matters relating to national security, international law, foreign, sovereign, and diplomatic immunity, and the Freedom of Information and Privacy Acts. His clients typically include former and current federal employees, particularly intelligence and military officers, defense contractors, whistleblowers, and members of the media who have grievances, have been wronged, or are being investigated by agencies of the United States government or foreign governments. Mark is also the executive director and founder of the James Madison Project, a Washington, D.C. based organization with the primary purpose of educating the public on issues relating to intelligence gathering and operations, secrecy policies, national security, and government wrongdoing. And he is an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University in the Global Security Studies program and at Texas A&M's George H.W. Bush School of Government and Public Service, where he teaches on national security issues. Mark, welcome into the back room.
Thanks, Andy. Really appreciate being here.
So before we get into the heavy-duty political stuff, I see you're wearing a comic book T-shirt. Most people know you as a pretty prominent attorney. I don't know how many people know you as an avid collector. I think you collect comic books. You're very involved in that. What else do you collect?
Yeah, I mean, it's not even a collector. I've been a comic book dealer since high school
for
wow. 40 plus years. And I'm still engaged in the business. I'm actually an advisor to the Overstreet Comic Book Price Guide. The shirt I'm wearing is CGC, which is a company in Florida that I represent that independently grades comic books. So I love comics, and I collect the history, in particular, of comic books that are legal related, the issues that allowed DC Comics to trademark or copyright a title or a story, or copies of Action Comics, the second appearance of Superman that was allowed or used as an exhibit in litigation to shut down a competitor company for copyright violations back in 1939. And then I collect presidential memorabilia and documents of presidents and Supreme Court justices and other political leaders when they were just normal lawyers like me. You know, a copy of a legal brief they wrote, or a letter they signed on their law firm letterhead back decades and decades ago. Lots of disaster stuff, you name it, the Titanic, the Hindenburg, the Lusitania, the Andrea Doria, the assassinations of President Lincoln and Kennedy and Garfield and McKinley, all sorts of memorabilia surrounding just very historic events. I love history. I mean, it really comes down to collecting what you love, and I love history.
Well, that's, it's something you and I have in common. We spoke offline when we first started chatting. I have a framed case of all my old political buttons. We were talking about the Danny Bonaducci and Partridge Family lunchboxes and stuff like that. I went through that phase, and board games. I'll get into a phase, like old newspapers. I love collecting old newspapers. I have stacks and stacks and stacks. I don't even know if I'll ever look at this stuff, but it's just fun to collect history, to go look at a newspaper from when Truman was elected, or what were the prices of things and the ads in the papers, things like that.
It is. I love it. It's fascinating. There's a few facets to it. Of course, one, there is a nostalgic aspect of it. So, in fact, in pop culture for collecting, usually a lot of the values are impacted by the age of the individual who now has funds. As each decade, as you get into your 30s, your 40s, your 50s, and you have more disposable cash, what was reminiscent from that person's childhood oftentimes becomes the hot commodity of the day. So you might see a resurgence of, Cabbage Patch Kids, which have disappeared, even though for those of us of a certain age, oh my God, people got into fistfights over them back in the early 80s. But people might start collecting Pez dispensers. We think back to, I remember vividly the cartoons I'm watching back in the early 70s or the television shows from probably, I wouldn't have watched like the Banana Splits when it was first on, but the reruns just a couple of years later in the early to mid 70s. And, that just resonates with people. But there's also the aspect of what you're talking about where a newspaper or an item where we weren't alive, I wasn't alive either when Truman was president, and you look back at those and you see the differences in the style. Like try reading, I have a lot of newspapers from when Lincoln was assassinated. Try reading a newspaper from that day, that time frame. The print is the smallest. I don't know how everyone didn't have glasses, and it just gives you a headache. And ironically, as much as we are in probably the most divisive political environment we have been in as a country since the Civil War, the newspapers back not long ago were far more ideological and political than what we have today. There weren't that many mainstream newspapers. Almost everything was political in some way, because that's how everybody got their news. Obviously, back then, all you had was newspapers.
Right. It's a fun thing. I own a candy store in upstate New York, and it's a nostalgic kind of throwback place. And that's where I put a lot of my collectibles up on a shelf that runs along the top of the wall. And people just love it because you're right. It reminds them of childhood.
You have to get a comic book spinner rack from back in the 60s or 70s. And you don't have to sell the comics on it. I can help supply you the comics. Right. Okay. I can help you supply you to the spinner rack, actually, too. But that would be just a cool nostalgia thing, because that's where you bought comics back in the day.
Sure.
In like what we called stationery stores. And I grew up in New York and lived in upstate New York, too. So I will come visit.
You will be our official comic book consultant.
All right.
Another subject I want to ask you about, which I learned doing my little deep dive into your life, is you have an association or involvement with the JFK assassination. We just passed the 60th anniversary. What is your personal and professional relationship to this pivotal event in U.S. history?
Yeah, so for some reason, as a child, I got fascinated with historic events. And so I remember reading the Warren Commission report and books on the assassination back in the mid-1970s. And as I got older, I got more fascinated with it. There's so many aspects to the assassination from a theory standpoint, whether it's foreign policy, intelligence, national security, the organized crime, police departments, how they work, Secret Service, how they work, that I just continued to dive into it. I will tell you, my views have very much differed or changed, evolved is probably the best word, over the years. I started out, like I think many people do before you really dive into the case, as somewhat of a conspiracist. I was going to prove Oswald was innocent. That was my goal, literally, as I got into law school. And quite frankly, the more I researched, and especially when I moved to DC, became a lawyer who was active inside the intelligence, national security, military, law enforcement communities, not as an employee, only as representing people who are in these communities. And I started to also represent people connected to the case. I represented two of JFK Secret Service agents who were in the motorcade with him when he was assassinated. I represented a third one as well. I represented one of his primary mistresses, Judith Exner. I represented the consular official, the State Department Foreign Service officer, who Oswald threw his passport at when he defected to the Soviet Union in 1959. And I've represented many, many authors of assassination conspiracy books to sue the U.S. government to get the documents released under the Freedom of Information Act, and then later the JFK Assassination Record Collection Act, which I helped to create the review board and sketch out definitions. And I tell you, I became far more of, I think Oswald did it. I don't have any problems believing that. I'm an Occam's razor type person. Simplest explanation is the best. And if you want to take away this notion, every sort of brick you take away from the wall of the official lone gunman theory, you have to replace it with something else. And I just haven't been persuaded by the facts that many of the conspiracists have brought. Doesn't mean there aren't legitimate facts. I've handled many, many conspiracy cases over the years. I mean, I represented Mohammed Al-Fayed, whose son Dodi was killed with Princess Diana, investigating that case. The Pan Am 103 Lockerbie case. I sued Lockerbie. Not Lockerbie. Lockerbie's awesome. Sued Libya for the bombing. The Lincoln assassination. We tried to exhume John Wilkes Booth to try and disprove or prove a conspiracy theory. So you've got to replace it with something. And while there are legitimate questions that still exist, either they're not answerable at this time, or it just, to me, it's not plausible. I tell and I joke around to the folks at the CIA all the time, because I sue them all the time, that what I see inside the CIA with representing its employees just solidifies in my mind. There's no way the CIA could have ever pulled off the assassination, because it's far too incompetent and disorganized.
Mm-hmm. Do you think people just love conspiracy theories, not just with the JFK assassination, but just in general, because it just fits our narrative of, like, we love drama, we love Hollywood, we love a good story, and to your point, sometimes the story is just the simplest one. And it's, the easiest one to accept at face value, but often we just don't want to do that.
Yeah, I mean, particularly to the Kennedy assassination, the difficulty for a lot of people was that this 24-year-old, frankly, loser, was able to pull off the assassination and the death of Camelot. I mean, look, I don't, if you were alive, I don't know if you're older than me, younger than me, we're probably around the same age.
I was around when Lincoln was shot.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So you might remember the Kennedy assassination. I wasn't born yet. It was a few years later for me. But I guess the way we can liken it to, at least like when Obama was first elected in 2008, there was, regardless of whether you liked him or not, a spirit of real hope and energy inside the country overall, which is why he got so many southern states and Republicans to vote for him. And that existed with Kennedy, but it was a very different time with respect to, the best generation, World War II hero, prominent family, very young. And he was only 43 when he got elected to be president, which is unbelievable. Even an even younger, more attractive wife, babies that they were having in the White House. I mean, the spirit that was there, even though it was a very tumultuous time and a difficult foreign policy time. I mean, one of the closest times we possibly came to nuclear war in the history of our country was during his administration with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And obviously the Bay of Pigs didn't help, and others. So to have him just snuffed out like that by just this guy who has had, the worst life, unsuccessful, unremarkable, other than he defected to the Soviet Union, so maybe that's remarkable, life was very difficult to accept for many people, which is a little bit different now, because I represent one of the Secret Service agents who was at Butler, Pennsylvania when President Trump was almost assassinated, and I represent the former director of the Secret Service who resigned in the aftermath. And I have actually been somewhat shocked how little I have seen of any conspiracy theories. They exist, but mainstream or interest in diving down. Like, I still haven't seen much about the kid who did it.
Right. I was just having a conversation with somebody last week about this, and I said, we're still talking about Oswald, but this kid seems to have just disappeared from our culture.
Yeah, it's been very fascinating not to see, and I suppose it's clearly because he was killed instead of having a trial, but because we still talk. I saw John Hinckley, the Reagan assassination. John Hinckley was the one who tried to kill him, and I saw something in the news the other day because he's opening up, I think, a record shop or something in Southern Virginia.
Right.
I mean, he still is in the news. Or I guess many people probably have not heard today of Squeaky Fromm, who tried to kill President Ford unsuccessfully. I think she's still in prison, as I recall. Or Arthur Bremer, who tried to kill Wallace here in Maryland, in my local D.C. area. He's out of prison and has stayed. He's still around. I think he's like 80 or 90 years old or something like that. He's pretty old, I believe, because that was back in 70 or so, 72. But this kid obviously was killed during the course of his attempt. And as much as I have participated in the official investigations representing my clients, and I will tell you, there has been, nor needed there be for the Secret Service, no questions about the guy, because they wouldn't have done that. That would have been the FBI. But even in the public hearings that I have seen, I mean, I just haven't seen anything about him. I've always been wondering more about him, the motives, what's on his computer, what conversations did he have with friends? I mean, that would be very interesting to me, but there's never going to be a trial. And I'm not even sure how active, if active at all, the FBI investigation is. But it's remarkable to me that story disappeared so quickly.
Right.
Or the guy who tried to kill the president after, who I presume will be going to trial at some point, but obviously never got a shot off.
There's 2 attempted assassinations within the span of a few months, and it's like it never happened. And to your point, yes, the kid got shot and killed, but so did Oswald, right? Like Oswald was killed within 24 hours, but it didn't stop decades and decades of exploration and investigation and so on. But
it even made it actually more implausible to many people. Of course, Oswald was killed on the first one, killed on live television. We've been watching the last few days, sadly, to watch the CEO of United Healthcare get gunned down. And I've been amazed, even though I have never seen it on any of the major networks. It's close enough where you see the guy walking right behind him with the silencer 9mm, and what happens in the next millisecond. But Oswald was the first live assassination on television when Jack Ruby killed him. Of course, Ruby wasn't law enforcement, so that just fueled all the fire as to, well, how in the world could that happen? How could someone get into the police headquarters, into the garage, and just gun him down while he's handcuffed to the police officers? Actually, I had lunch with one of those guys. They're all passed away now, but I had lunch with the one with the Stetson hat.
Oh, really?
Back in 30 years ago. Yeah, nice guy.
With regard to Ruby, if it was just a lone gunman, a lone wolf, mentally unstable, no connection to Russia, no connection to the mob, no connection to anyone, just a disgruntled guy who took out Kennedy, why would someone like Ruby, who was just like a strip club owner and like a gangster, was he that patriotic that he wanted to kill this guy? Why would someone, especially like Jack Ruby, do what he did?
Yeah, so a friend of mine just wrote a book on this last year for the anniversary on it, and the many faces of Jack Ruby. And the one theory that everyone usually heard was that he wanted to prevent Jackie from coming down to Dallas to have to testify in a trial. Turns out it looks like that was actually a legal theory that the lawyers put out, sort of a sentiment to try and generate some publicity and favorable publicity for him. Because again, how difficult is it going to be to defend someone from murder when everybody watched it on live television, right? So no shock he got convicted. Although the conviction got overturned on appeal because of unfair pretrial publicity. They didn't move the trial outside of Dallas. He was, so his true name was Jacob Rubenstein. He was Jewish, as am I. And he was really torn by the fact that there was advertising in the days before that made it appear to be that Jews didn't like Kennedy. And he was very concerned. There is some evidence that that would carry over, and he wanted to show that Jews had strength to take a shot at Oswald. It was very much a crime of opportunity, although he seems to have been somewhat stalking him, because he showed up at the police conference Friday night after Oswald was arrested, and he had his gun in his pocket, but he, for whatever reason, didn't do anything. And then Sunday morning, after he sent a $20 wire to one of his strippers, he happened to walk by the police station, and even though Oswald was supposed to have been transferred an hour earlier, he walked down the stairs, and right at the time Oswald was being brought out to be transferred, and he pulled the gun out of his pocket, and the rest is history. But there's just no evidence to show that there was any connections to anything. He left his best friend. We talk about pets with my cat. There are dogs in the house too. His best friend was Sheba, his dog. And anyone who would be interviewed would say he would never do anything that would negatively impact Sheba, if I'm remembering her name right. I think I am. And he left her in the car. So it just, that, I mean, for people who are real dog lovers and like, you know, he's single, he's never been married. This is his life, is his dog. You know, to think that you're going to sacrifice that, you know, it was just, that was another piece of evidence that, you know, I understand how people want to think, how in the world could this happen? There has to be some connection. But literally 20 minutes earlier, he was sending a wire transfer and, or not electronic, obviously, like Western Union. And the people who were interviewed, who were in the line with him, were like, he was just standing there, you know, not a care in the world. It just happened to be coincidence.
You know, people say he owed the mob a lot of money, and this was, you know, they made him do this as payback or whatever.
He did have ties to organized crime, really low level. I mean, he was a strip club owner, especially in Dallas in the 1960s. But there's, and he was an informant for the FBI for a little bit of time back in 1959, but in which the Warren Commission didn't know, because I met with the lawyer who's still around. He wrote a book too, Burt Griffin. He was the junior lawyer, because the senior lawyers are all passed away now, who investigated Ruby. And they didn't know about the FBI connection, which is part of the failure of the Warren Commission of, this is what's bad about government. Agencies withholding information from other agencies.
Right.
Forget about withholding it from the public, withholding it from other federal agencies who are doing an official investigation by, you know, set in place by the President of the United States. But it wouldn't have changed anything, because so what? You know, so what that he informed on people to the FBI? He was in a business where there's a lot of, you know, certainly then, I don't know, maybe even today, you know, where there are criminal elements that are attached to it. So yeah, of course he was an informant, but there's just absolutely no proof. I'll give you one final example. The FBI was illegally wiretapping quite a number of senior organized crime members. You know, so they didn't know they were being wiretapped at all. And these tapes exist and the transcripts exist. And some of the primary organized crime members who are always talked about as being, this is who would have done it. The tape recordings in the aftermath of Ruby killing Oswald, they're talking about Jack Ruby. Who the hell is that? Do we know Jack Ruby? What do we have any ties to Jack Ruby? I mean, so again, they didn't know they were being wiretapped because one, it was illegal for them in that context. So there's just no proof. I would say, I never say no proof. There's no proof that has persuaded me, at least. Others may differ.
Well, to put a punctuation on this conversation, I just realized I have a lot in common with Jack Ruby. I love dogs, I'm single, and I'm a Jew.
There you go.
What a way to close out that chat. All right, so let's talk politics. And I say this with sarcasm. A whopping 49.9% of voters gave Trump what he calls a landslide and a mandate. He ran on a campaign of grievance and vengeance, vowing revenge against his opponents and his perceived enemies, without naming names unless you want to. How many of these high-profile targets are you representing?
I have a few, and these, I mean, some of them are public. Folks like Olivia Troy, who was Vice President Pence's domestic security advisor in the White House. Mark Polymeropoulos, who was a former decorated CIA case officer, who was one of the primary draftsmen of the Hunter Biden laptop letter from October 2020, which has been a fixation of Trump and his allies. Fred Wellman, who was the executive director of the Lincoln Project at one point. Those three I still represent, but I also, at one time, not now, currently, I represented Mark Esper, the former Secretary of Defense. I represented H.R. McMaster's, the former national security advisor. And then there are quite a number of people on the inside that I have represented who have worked on various of the law enforcement activities against him that he would perceive for them to be his enemies, where the reality was they were just doing their job.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about Olivia Troy for a second. She, just for background, she served in the Trump administration on national security issues before working in Vice President Mike Pence's office. This week, she posted the letter that you and her received from Kash Patel's attorney. Kash Patel, of course, being the nominee for Trump's FBI director. They demanded a retraction for comments she made on MSNBC about his fitness to serve. And then you tweeted about Patel that he was, quote, thin-skinned. What can you tell us about this matter? Does this have any legs, or is this just public bluster?
And to me, it's bluster, but we always tell clients, prospective clients, somebody comes to us, if they ask, can I sue this person? And we go, yeah, of course you can sue. All you got to do is pay the filing fee and you can sue.
Right.
Can you win? That's a different topic to have a discussion about. So what Kash Patel will do, I have no idea. I was surprised to receive this letter, very much so. The law firm involved is one of Trump's lawyers. They are one of the go-to lawyers for the MAGA movement. They represented Robinson down in, it was North Carolina, South Carolina, right? Whichever state that was. Sorry to the Carolinas. I'm just blanking on which one you are. They represent, we have a history with them because they represent Rick Grinnell, the former ambassador to Germany and acting director of national intelligence, who has sued Olivia Troy. So we've been in litigation with this law firm for Olivia since mid 2023. They also represent Devin Nunes in a number of lawsuits. They represent Kash Patel in a number of lawsuits. He has sued a number of individuals over the last few years, including Politico and various reporters that are still ongoing. And also Michael Flynn. That's why I'm representing Fred Wellman. Michael Flynn, the former national security advisor, has sued Fred Wellman for defamation, as well as a number of other people. And all of them are being represented by this one law firm. So to me, for one thing, what Olivia said, regardless of whether it's true or not, I won't get into that, although I think it's kind of easy to debate. What she said was exactly what everybody else has been saying, on countless people, other than those, I guess, on the MAGA side. For one thing, she repeated what Mark Esper wrote in his book. That's why I represented Secretary Esper, was to get the book declassified and approved for publication. He wrote about an episode with Niger, the country in Africa, and SEAL Team 6 going in and apparently an issue with Kash Patel about securing airspace approval for overflight. And so she was repeating information. And anyone who wants to go on X or Blue Sky or Threads can find far worse about Kash Patel written there. Or if you just want to watch MSNBC or other networks or CNN, you'll see some incredibly negative things about him, because there's a lot to be discussed about his history. I've known him for many years. He used to be a staffer on the House Select Committee on Intelligence. He was Devin Nunes's guy. And quite frankly, I was friends with Congressman Nunes. We worked together on the Benghazi case from 2013. He was a really good ally on that for my CIA clients. So here it is, we get this letter, and it's a blustery, threatening letter. I mean, it's full of just rhetoric, over the top statements, and which is fine. That's the style of some lawyers. I've been guilty of stuff like that myself. The CIA used to complain to me to please stop doing that, because I would send them a kind of blustery letter, because I knew I would give it to the press after, and I wanted to have something cool to say. But I get this, and as far as what I'm thinking, I'm like, dude, you're up to be the director of the FBI and you're concerned about this one woman saying that you're a liar on television, you're going to be facing a hell of a lot more as the director of FBI. I mean, look what Comey faced. Look what Ray faced. Look what Hoover faced. I mean, maybe not Hoover back at the time he was alive facing it because everybody's too scared to say anything. But in modern time, I mean, this is ridiculous. And you're going to start threatening suits. So all he did by sending this letter is to solidify the concern that so many people have that the Trump administration is going to be solely, if maybe not solely, very significantly about retribution and retaliation. You haven't even got into office yet, and you're threatening to sue people for comments, negative comments, First Amendment expression, which, of course, you've suffered no damages from whatsoever. And truth is the best defense. So, you know, bring it, Cash. If you want to sue Olivia, we're ready.
Yeah, and the irony is that Trump and Musk, that they're all like, you know, the free speech proponents, but they're the first ones to cry like babies when people say things that they don't like.
Which I guess, hey, you know, Kash Patel wrote a children's book, and I guess that's why he can relate.
Yeah, something. What was the title? Like you went against the king or something like that crazy thing. But you see, this is what I was gonna say. Like, to understand like Trump's legal strategy, you almost have to tie in his psychological pathology as it also relates to his sycophantic ecosystem. So a distinction that I have made is, like, to your point, there are a lot of people who say a lot of things about Trump. But then there are the people like Olivia Troy who have done what Trump believes is the worst thing someone can do to him, and that's to be disloyal, right? So there's that group of people who say things or have done things, but end up on his alleged enemies list because they didn't have loyalty to the king.
Yeah, and obviously, and Patel wrote in his adult book, he's got a list of like 61 former and current government officials on it. And there are other lists. They speak about lawfare. That is a term that I'm not sure where it came from in this context, but Michael Flynn kept saying it, and is now a catchphrase within the MAGA movement of lawfare, meaning, in what the way they describe it, it was the use of the Justice Department and the Biden administration to, as well as New York and Georgia, to prosecute Trump, to use lawfare against him. The reality is, it's the MAGA movement that has used lawfare for the last 5-6 years in the civil context. Civil lawsuit after civil lawsuit after civil lawsuit. In both the Grinnell and the Flynn cases that I'm involved with, we filed, it's the same law firm that's representing them all. We filed actually for motions for sanctions against the lawyers. No decisions yet in either case as to whether that will be granted or chastised even. But the reason why we did it was we demonstrated in the lawsuit a litany of frivolous cases, certainly cases that were lost, some cases where the lawyers were actually sanctioned who worked on the Trump matters, not necessarily that law firm, but other lawyers who they co-counseled with who were sanctioned for bringing these cases. And there's a pattern with it. And they use it for two purposes. One, it's to stifle criticism of their opponents, their perceived or actual enemies. And it is not fun to receive a letter like the one I did for Olivia. It is not fun to be a defendant. It is very stressful. It doesn't matter whether you think you're going to win or not. I mean, I've been a defendant and I'm a litigator, so I know what to expect. And you still feel some stress because you never know what's going to happen in a particular courtroom. So they also obviously use it for purposes of financially draining people. It is really expensive to defend. And unless you get someone like me, unfortunately, who does these cases pro bono, because we do fundraising, so like I'm not out of pocket, I need to make a living, but the person who was sued, at least, it isn't facing loss financially. And then finally, they used it for fundraising themselves. And in fact, Kash Patel helped fund the Grinnell lawsuit. They admitted that. But they also did a ton of fundraising off of these lawsuits. And that money kind of disappears. And there's very few records of where it goes and into whose pockets.
Mm-hmm. I know as of about a couple of weeks ago, you were advising at least some of your clients, perhaps, to leave the country, which was it got a lot of play in the press, and it is a pretty dramatic statement to be making. Is that still the case? And if so, why should people leave the country?
So, the media, of course, always seizes on like the most dramatic of the suggestions. I made lots of different suggestions,
Mm-hmm.
And that was just one of them for the smallest number of people. And my opinion on it varies sort of day to day, because when I watch to see how I kept telling people, having been around for the first Trump administration, and seeing how disorganized they were.
Mm-hmm.
And I kept telling people now, they are much better organized. They are much better prepared. They will be ready to go on day one. And they know what they want to do and how to do it, because now they have the experience of having been there the first 4 years. But yet what we've watched in the last few weeks since the election was how disorganized and incompetent, frankly, they have been.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the nominees are perfectly suitable and will absolutely sail through confirmation.
Rubio.
Just blank. Marco Rubio,
Mm-hmm.
for sure. That's a normal pick.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the others as well. But to then see someone like Matt Gaetz get nominated, and what's going on with Pete Hegseth, even if he might still survive, the notion that it seems apparent the campaign didn't know about these issues is really poorly reflective on their capabilities. So I'm a little less concerned, perhaps, because of their incompetence, much in the way I don't think the CIA killed President Kennedy.
Mm-hmm.
But nonetheless, when I see someone like Kash Patel, a Pam Bondi, who probably will get confirmed, who has threatened retaliation against enemies, where we have seen the president and others say they should bring back Mark Milley to be court-martialed, bring him back to active duty and court-martial him. There are some people that I do think, small in number, not necessarily my clients, that it would make sense to be out of the country the first few days of inauguration to see what would happen, because I really do think they're going to act swiftly on a number of issues, and we'll get a sense. And I'm not telling someone to sell their home, drain their bank accounts from money in the United States. I'm like, just go on vacation. Are you going to take a vacation in 2025? Take it in January. Just be outside to see what happens. And even more so, if you live in the DC area and you've been a vocal critic, don't be at home around Inauguration Day, because I'm concerned of the wackadoodles coming to people's homes. Not the government, not the Trump people, but those who showed up at the Capitol on January 6th. Many of us have been doxxed. Many of us have been swatted, and I include myself, for having done what we do just as our job in representing people as lawyers. And there is always a concern post what we call Pizzagate, for those that remember, where this lone gunman shows up at a well-known pizza place here in DC to save the children who Hillary Clinton had captive in the basement of the building in a pedophile ring. Problem was, there's no basement in that building. So what pedophile ring are you talking about? And that was a really scary moment for a lot of us, because there was no way to know that this guy was coming. And thank God no one got injured as he shot the place up with his AR-15 or whatever it was. But it's an extreme situation, and I say it not to be Chicken Little, the sky is falling, because that's not my view, or the boy who cried wolf. I'm listening to what they say they're going to do, and I'm taking them at their word. And I think it would be foolish and naive not to. And as a fellow Jew, as we have established here with Jack Ruby. Although Jack Ruby was born in the United States, didn't serve in World War II. I had family members murdered by the Nazis in 1930s. I'm not going down that route, and I'm not accusing that that's what's going to happen at all. But anyone who knows history knows Hitler was elected into office, and it was a slow progress over years in the government of Germany modifying laws. You know, the Nuremberg laws of 1935 it didn't just happen overnight. And there is a lot of comparison between the Hitler administration and Trump. Doesn't mean concentration camps, doesn't mean exterminations, doesn't mean genocide. Not at all. 1930s Germany, very, very different than the 2020s of the United States. But there are authoritarian concerns that exist and certain type of qualities that exist. And while we may never, and I doubt we will ever, and I hope we never will, get anywhere close to what happened back then, I'm not going to be stupid enough not to take it seriously that is a pathway in some alternative reality, and I'm going to be prepared.
Absolutely. As a student of history, I couldn't agree with you more. In fact, back in 2015, I was writing a lot for Huffington Post. I was on their homepage almost every day, and until I wrote a piece called Trump and Hitler, and they said we're going to take a pass on this one. It was too controversial. Now everybody's making the comparisons. It was so easy to see 9 years ago. So what you're talking about today with what we know, it is a no-brainer. With regard to the people in Congress or former Congress people who would be on such an enemies list if it does exist, people like Adam Schiff, Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, Jamie Raskin, how solid and expansive is the Constitution's speech and debate clause in protecting them? Are they insulated in a way?
So the speech and debate clause gives them criminal immunity per the Supreme Court for statements and actions taken on the floor of the House and the Senate, as well as in committees. So basically, anything that is done officially within the confines of the building, for sure, is criminally immune. There's also civil immunity under what we call the Westfall Act, because I've sued former members of Congress. I sued John Murtha, who was a very popular Democrat in Pennsylvania, now deceased. I sued him for defamation 15 plus years ago, almost 20 years ago, actually, regarding Haditha, which was a horrible event in the city of Haditha in Iraq, where a group of Marines killed a lot of innocent people. And I represented one of the Marines. And he was deemed to have been immune from civil liability for media appearances he gave on CNN and at private events. But that was a decision of the executive branch. So that could be waived by the Trump administration and not defend the member of Congress were there a civil action. Now, I think the reality is I'm really not concerned for the sitting members of Congress or the former members for actions tied to their official conduct, because I really do believe, not that I don't think the Trump administration would like to go after them, but I don't think the Republicans in Congress will support it, because what's good for the goose is good for the gander.
Absolutely.
If you go down that route, if you hold Liz Cheney responsible for something she did on the January 6th Select Committee as a sitting member of Congress, then Jim Jordan, you may be in trouble during the President Newsom administration in 4 years or whatever it might be. So I really do think that you're not going to see a lot of support from either the House or the Senate, especially since the House is so split. There'll be members, of course, who will say, yeah, we want to bring them before. They might bring them before Congress for investigations. That's a possibility, right? Subpoena Liz Cheney to come in and embarrass her and things like that. But I'm not as concerned from a criminal standpoint. Yev Vinman is one of my clients. Both Vinman brothers have been my clients. Yev was now elected to Congress to replace Abigail Spanberger, who's running for governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia. And Yev was a lawyer on the NSC with his brother, who they were both active duty Army at the time, and they were tied up in the first Trump impeachment, where I also represented the intelligence community whistleblower, who was not either of them. It was somebody else completely. But they were all whistleblowers, and they're all on the enemies list. But now, as he's a sitting member of Congress, he probably has much better protection than the rest of us.
Both Vindman brothers have been on this podcast. They're great people, as is Alex's wife, Rachel.
True heroes.
And they've been taking it hard lately. Musk tweeted something that was kind of threatening.
About Alex, that he was taking money from Ukrainian oligarchs, and he's treasonous, he's a traitor. Something about, and this is again goes back to the Kash Patel letter. Although obviously Musk is not in government, but he's wherever Trump goes, he's his sidecar right nowadays.
Yep.
And he tweeted out something like, I'm going to paraphrase. It's basically, it was a threat that you're going to be held accountable.
Right.
Really?
Right.
For what? For doing what? What are you going to do?
Yeah. Sounds like a lot of bluster. My last question, in the burn it all down of things that people are fearing with the DOJ and the FBI and elsewhere in an incoming Trump administration, how protected are career civil service workers at institutions like those?
Not as protected as people might think. Now, it is very hard oftentimes to fire a federal civil servant, although hard in the sense that there's a process and it may take some time, but ultimately not that difficult. I have had a lot of clients fired, unfortunately, over the years, as much as we try and prevent it. But if he issues Schedule F, which will take protections away, he says he's going to do it again, that weakens the civil service protections. And I will tell you, since most of my work is in the intelligence community arena, the national security arena, those individuals, by existing policy, can be fired without any due process. The security clearances of anyone there, and I have one, there's 5 million, give or take, of us who have security clearances, and that clearance can be stripped from us without any due process under existing law. Existing policy gives us administrative due process, but if the government doesn't want to do it, it doesn't have to, and it can hide behind the shield of national security, and federal courts will not accept jurisdiction over security clearance related decisions. So we may see, and I think we're going to see, one of or both of two things. I think you're going to see a lot of resignations of folks before we get there. I think retirements, resignations. I think you're going to see a lot of people in the immediate aftermath do the same as certain steps or actions are taken by the Trump administration. And then I think you're going to see a lot of people fired or put into positions that they don't like. For example, and this has been litigated before, that the FBI can transfer any agent it wants anywhere. So if someone like Kash Patel comes in, and there have been agents who were identified to have worked on the Mueller investigation, who have worked on the Smith investigations, prosecutions, that those people all of a sudden get assigned to a, out of the way field office in the United States. I won't pick a city because I don't want to attack any particular state, but someone who lives on the East Coast with their family gets assigned to the West Coast, and that forces them to have to quit,
right,
because their kids are in school, whatever it might be. I think you're going to see a lot of cases like that. There will be a lot of us as lawyers who are challenging as much as we can these types of actions, but I am concerned that because I know how the law is already structured, that there will be very little we can do, at least in the short term. I think in the long term, things will go back to normal, but the long term could be years. It could be the next administration, could be a Vance administration, or it could be, a Kamala Harris administration, Dean Phillips, who the hell knows, down the line. The courts are slow. We saw that with the Trump prosecutions. And when you have the wherewithal to fight, that the case in Mar-a-Lago was an open and shut case. I mean, I've handled those cases. Any normal person would have pled guilty because there's no way they would have risked going to trial on those sets of facts. But because he has virtually unlimited funds. And it's not because he's a billionaire. It's because he took all the money that was contributed to him by his supporters, which he then used for his legal fees. So he had an army of lawyers, and they came up with every argument they could, just throw the spaghetti against the wall, hoping something would stick. And they lucked out with the judge they were assigned, and spaghetti stuck. And then, we are where we are. No more prosecutions.
Yeah.
But I would say I've said this on another podcast, so I don't mind saying it again here. And I know enough people who are starting to say it. We're expecting Trump and his allies to do what they promised they're going to do.
Mm-hmm.
And if they do that, I think they're going to burn this country to the ground. And I will sit back and I will watch, and I will do what I can to put those flames out as a former volunteer firefighter for many years. But I have a feeling there's going to be a lot of fires in this country, and we're going to need a whole bunch of forests to burn and rebuild before we can come out of it.
Well, Mark, you're going to need to come back and talk with us again sooner than later, because there is so much to discuss, and it is going to be a challenging road ahead. Thanks for coming on, and I look forward to the next chat.
Anytime, Andy. And I have these comics available for you.
Well, we're going to talk about that, trust me. All righty, take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. This episode of The Back Room was edited and produced by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-edited and co-produced by Maddie Rosenberg, and co-produced by Jen Hammoud. Our theme song was composed by Andrew Hollander, and our logo was designed by Cricket Langell. And special thanks to Patricia Wind. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, and also follow or subscribe. Until next time, keep your eyes on Washington, Hollywood, and your own backyards, and have a great week.